Welcome to this third vodcast in the Hebrews course, this one on the situation of Hebrews. We're kind of following on the audience of Hebrews vodcast that was prior to this. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, you might go back and look at that a little bit. Well, let's get right into it. Hebrews has two kind of genres, subgenres primarily. It has exhortations that are kind of like commands, do this, don't do that. And it has exposition, which is kind of teaching and preaching. Exhortations are kind of like preaching, and the exposition is kind of like teaching. And the author kind of goes back and forth between these, holds people's attention. George Guthrie has written a monograph on the literary structure of Hebrews, and he's done a great job of talking about how these two subgenres relate to each other. But of course, the exhortations of Hebrews are where we're going to find what Hebrews is really about, what it's really attacking or addressing. And so we're trying to figure out what the situation of Hebrews is. That's the best place to start. Let's look at some of the exhortations of Hebrews. 10:36. You guys have need of endurance, so that after you've done the will of God, you'll receive the promise. Okay, so we can see here that the audience has need to keep going. They need to keep running. They've got a few more laps to go. They need to keep going. I was in Africa for a couple of months back in the 90s, and they had this kind of field day, sports day, and I tried to run a 3-mile kind of race there. Came in second to last, only because the other guy had never run before, and he conked out. He was actually a lap or two ahead of me when he conked out. It was very embarrassing, but I did finish. I kept going. I kept my feet moving. Anybody who's run a marathon, when you get to mile 20, here's my advice. Just one foot in front of the next. Just don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. And that's kind of what Hebrews is about. Hebrews is about an author encouraging its audience to buck up, little camper. Keep going. Take one foot and put one foot in front of the next and make it to the end of the race. Here's another one. We're not people who shrink back to destruction. We're people who keep going and obtain life. And let me just say here, I'm not trying to be argumentative. I just want to make it clear that you just have completely missed the meaning of Hebrews if you think that there's not a real possibility for them not to make it. All of the arguments, about eternal security or those kinds of things simply have no place in understanding Hebrews. Hebrews is the naughty book of the New Testament when it comes to any doctrine of eternal security. Of course, there are naughty verses for every tradition. But you simply cannot understand Hebrews if you don't realize that this is a real possibility of not making it in the end, because that's what it's all about. It's about keeping going until the end. Let's look at some other exhortations. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, therefore it is necessary for us to hold fast to what we've heard, lest we drift away. Again, same basic theme. We need to keep going. We can't drift away. Let's look at the rest of this passage. If the word spoken through angels was firm, and every disobedience and transgression received a just punishment, then, man, how will we escape if we neglect such a great salvation spoken by the Lord? I mean, he's greater than angels. And so if you got punished when you didn't listen to the word delivered through angels, then imagine what it's going to be like if you don't listen to the word that was spoken through Jesus. And so, again, this idea of don't give up. Keep going. Keep on keeping on. Let's look at some more. 3:6. And we are Christ's house if we hold fast our boldness and boasting in hope. This is an iffy if, on pair. If we hold fast our boldness, we are Christ's house. Now, again, I'm not meaning to be hard on certain traditions, but you sometimes hear the argument, once you're a son, you're a son. Okay, Hebrews just doesn't know what you're talking about. This is Hebrews 3:1 through 6. It's talking about children in God's house, and it says we are God's house if we hold fast the boldness. In fact, the rest of that passage, 3:7 through 4:11, goes on to compare the audience of Hebrews to the wilderness generation. Did they leave Egypt? Yes, they left Egypt, but they didn't make it to Canaan. Their corpses fell in the desert. And this is a wake-up call. So you, audience of Hebrews, if you don't persist into the end and enter into God's rest, you're a goner. You need to keep going. Keep pressing on. Now, there are two key exhortations in Hebrews that they flank the central section, the central argument of Hebrews. There's lots of different proposals for the literary structure of Hebrews, and that's not really that important. You'll kind of see what I think as we go through the book. But it is at least clear that at 4:14 through 16 and 10:19 and following, you have a kind of parenthesis for the central argument of Hebrews, which is about the high priesthood of Christ. This is, they have very similar wording, and it must give us what the bottom line of all that argument is all about. Here they are, 4:14. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold on to the confession. Our confession in Jesus, the Son of God, I presume, primarily. And let's look at the end. Therefore, having boldness to enter into the holiest place by the blood of Jesus, let us hold fast our confession of hope. Do you see how that this idea of holding on to what we believe, keeping going, enduring, not giving up on faith, is the key exhortation that Hebrews is all about. Now, of course, there is the let me pause. Let me pause before I get to the central exhortation of Hebrews. There is that central exhortation in the middle, and it starts at 5:11. But let's first give an alert as to what we've seen so far. Notice that in what we've looked at so far, the author has not told the audience to stop relying on the Levitical cultus. In other words, we've found no verse that has said, you guys need to stop going to the temple, or you need to start, mailing money to the priest, to get your sins atoned for. We don't have anything like that. All the arguments have been rely on Christ. We have a great priest. Keep to the code. Hold on to the confession. In other words, the arguments of Hebrews are primarily positive in relation to Christ, rather than negative in relation to the sacrificial system. This is important. Now, let's go to the key exhortation of Hebrews, which is in 5:11. Now, Hebrews is going, the trains are moving. We're talking about high priests, what a high priest is like. Jesus, similar to other high priests, and then all of a sudden, we come to a screeching halt, and the author says, we interrupt this exposition to bring you a key word from our sponsor. And basically, Hebrews says, these are the scary words, the naughty verses of Hebrews. You guys need to get your act together. You should be teachers by now. And yet you need somebody to teach you the ABCs of the oracles of God. What's up with that? So let's leave this beginning word about the Christ and bring it on. Bring on perfection. Let's move on. Let's go on the rest of the way. And here's the scary verse. For it is impossible for those who have been enlightened and tasted of the heavenly gift. They've become partakers of Holy Spirit. They've tasted the good word of God, the powers of the coming age. It is impossible if they fall away, be renewing themselves to repentance, since they crucify the Son all over again and expose him to public disgrace. This is a scary verse. And again, now I agree with David De Silva that this verse is more like holding a stick over them. The author goes on to say, I'm convinced of better things with regard to you people. In other words, the author does think that they're going to make it. But it's pretty clear that he thinks that they're in danger of some sort. There's got to be some kernel of reality out there that they might not in the end make it if they don't keep going. The verses right after this talk about how, when the water comes on the ground and it comes on the ground, the water rains, it rains, okay, why isn't stuff growing here? If that field, wait a minute, all this rain and all I'm getting are thorns and thistles, man, just burn it. Burn it all. These are scary verses. And there's no way around them. Hebrews is a scary book in that respect. So, what we can conclude from the exhortations of Hebrews is that the primary situation behind Hebrews is that the audience is wavering in its faith. They have need to endure. They have need to hold fast to the covenant, to the confession of Jesus Christ as Son of God. And we also have seen that this wavering confidence has something to do with the atonement provided by Christ. Not 100% sure exactly what that is, but there is something relating to atonement that is causing their wavering faith. So let's dig deeper. Let's speculate a little bit. Before I get to my speculation, a word from the opposition. Someone might say, wait a minute. You're saying that there's no command in Hebrews not to rely on the Levitical cultus. Well, what about 13, 9, and 10? Eh, Skank? What about this one? Don't get carried away by various and strange teachings. It is good for the heart to be established by grace and not by foods which have not benefited those who walked in them. So, what about this? And it goes on. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent do not have authority to eat. Now, these verses, of course, have inspired lots and lots of debate and discussion. I personally, we'll get to it eventually, Lord willing, but I basically think that this is talking about some Levitical option. There have been some who've argued, somebody argued against communion. I don't think that's true, but there is some food here, some food that is related to the cultus, the altar, the sacrificial system. There's some cultic food here in mind, apparently, that is strange, various, it's strange, and it is in some way enticing maybe some of the audience. So maybe this is what it's all about. Now, like I said, we'll get into it a little bit later, and I got ahead of myself here, but it seems to me that if this referred to the temple, it wouldn't call it strange. What Jew, for example, would refer to temple sacrifices as, oh, you believe you should go to the temple? What a strange teaching that is. I mean, you see what I'm saying? The Jerusalem temple is not strange. It's not various and strange. It doesn't fit the bill for what the author is talking about. Also, I don't think that these verses fit the bill for, finally, after all this talk about Jesus, high priest, finally tucked away in a little part of chapter 13, we finally know, he's telling them not to rely on temple foods or something like that. It doesn't make sense to me, especially since chapter 13 seems to be a little bit like a letter conclusion to the sermon. We've got the sermon, and then in chapter 13 we have kind of a more letter-esque conclusion. And the exhortations of Hebrews 13 are pop, pop, pop. Hey, don't be hospitable. Some people have entertained angels before. Don't be greedy. Let brotherly love continue. These kinds of things. It's not a and now after these little miscellaneous exhortations, the key to the whole epistle. I mean, it just doesn't seem like we would get a key to the whole epistle in some little side comment about various and strange teaching. So I think those verses are clearly related to the rest of Hebrews, the exposition of Hebrews. But I just don't think that those are, finally we get the key to what Hebrews is about, which is, of course, what Linder's are. Well, the exposition. If the exhortations give us the direct addressing of the situation, the exposition substantiates or backs up those commands and exhortations and admonitions. So, Hebrews 8:1 gives us a nice little snapshot of what Hebrews exposition is all about. The main thing in the things we're saying is that we have a great high priest who sat on the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens. So Christ's high priesthood and of course thereby the atonement provided by Christ would seem to be the main point. This backs up my claim earlier that if the main exhortation of Hebrews is keep going, then the exposition that substantiates it seems to relate to atonement, that in some way atonement is related to their lack of confidence and wavering faith. Okay, well, so what are my firm conclusions? I've already said them. Audience's faith is wavering. Primary source of this seems to relate to atonement in some way, in particular the atonement provided by Christ vis-a-vis Levitical cultus. Now, time for the speculation. Here's where it gets juicy. So, what if that's what we can with some certainty say about the situation behind Hebrews? Let's speculate a little, or listen to a few others. Of course, the traditional speculation is that Hebrews is about a group of Jewish believers who are tempted to return to mainstream Judaism for atonement. And there's more than one way to skin this. There is et tu, Bruce, F.F. Bruce, who argued that it's written before the temple's destruction, and they're tempted to go back to rely on the Jerusalem temple's sacrificial system. But we've also mentioned Barnabas Linders, who sees it as a feeling of a need to go back into the Jewish synagogue because of some substitute for their need for atonement after the temple's destruction. Okay, fine. These are both reasonable suggestions. I have some questions for Bruce and Linders, who thankfully are not in the room. In fact, they're in heaven, and so cannot rebut me. That's always an ideal situation. Bruce, here are my questions. First of all, what are we to make of 6:1 and 2? These are not knockdown, drag-out verses, but these are the verses I mentioned in the last podcast that seem to imply that when the audience became Christians, they believed in fundamental Jewish things, which would seem to imply that they weren't Jews, because Jews would have been exposed to those ideas well before they believed on Christ. So what of the fact of the argument I've made that the rhetoric of Hebrews seems to be primarily oriented toward a Gentile audience? Also, why is the temple never mentioned? If Hebrews is about not relying on the temple, why doesn't the author just spit it out and say, don't rely on the temple? Why does he use the word tabernacle? I've already mentioned that I think that the references to the tent rather than the temple fits very well a post-destruction date where you're reflecting on the temple's destruction in a kind of theoretical manner. Of course, you can turn the argument on me, as Luke Timothy Johnson does, and say, well, why isn't the destruction of the temple mentioned? Wouldn't that have been something significant for the author to use in his argument if it had already been destroyed? And I'll get to that in the next podcast on the date of Hebrews. And of course, why is the audience not told to refrain from temple worship, if in fact that's what it's all about? And of Linders, same question. What about the fact that the rhetoric seems to fit a Gentile audience better than a Jewish one? And is 13, 9, and 10, that whole various and strange teachings passage, is that really what the whole letter is about, tucked away in this kind of list of miscellaneous exhortations at the end? Now, I will say that I can imagine there being various and strange kind of sacrificial substitutes evolving in Jewish synagogues after the destruction of the temple. I can see that happening, and I'm actually quite willing to see that as whatever it is, what 13, 9, and 10 are about. I just don't think that really fits the bill for the heart of Hebrews' extensive argument that Christ is superior to any earthly sanctuary. Well, my turn. A proposal for the situation of Hebrews. First of all, I've already argued that Hebrews reads better as a kind of encouragement for an audience troubled by the destruction of the temple, rather than as a polemic against reliance on the temple. In other words, Hebrews' argument is positive. It's about relying on Christ and enduring. It's not about not relying on something. It reads much better as a consolation than a polemic. Well, for you scholars out there, let me make it clear that I realize that there is a genre, a Roman genre of consolation, or a Greco-Roman genre of consolation that Hebrews is not in that genre. I'm not arguing for consolation as a technical term. I'm just saying that Hebrews reads better as an encouragement to those who are troubled by the absence of atonement by the temple, rather than a polemic against reliance on the temple. It nowhere tells its audience not to rely on the temple. Its argument is reflective and theoretical, as we would expect after the temple's destruction. It doesn't talk about the temple. It talks theoretically of the tabernacle. Secondly, what if some Christians at the time had not yet realized the full sufficiency of Christ's death? Now, here I want to emphasize the word some. I'm not saying that all Christians at this time didn't recognize the full sufficiency of Christ's death as a sacrifice. I'm only suggesting that some do. And I think it's almost certain I think it is virtually certain that there were many Christians who did not understand Christ's death to be the end of all sacrifices. And I'm going to give you a few reasons why I think that's the case. For one thing, Jewish tradition would not have set them up to see it that way. The closest background in Judaism for the idea that a noble death might provide atonement for sins or assuage the wrath of God, the closest parallel is in the Maccabean literature, in particular, 2nd and 4th Maccabees, where the noble deaths of 7 righteous brothers brings God's wrath toward Israel to an end during the Maccabean crisis. When you ask, when the disciples are wrestling with the significance of the death of Christ, I don't think they understood that Christ was going to die. The idea that Messiah dies would not have computed with the early disciples. And so when they were seeking for some sort of a precedent or model by which to understand Christ's death, I think that this idea that a righteous death can atone for sins would have been an early candidate. I'm not saying they stayed there, but clearly I think many Jews would have viewed Christ's death in that way. Now, the key to that model is that kind of a righteous death doesn't naturally play into the idea of death for all sins for all times. The idea is that at this point in history, the righteous death has hit the reset button on God's relationship with Israel. I think it's very probable, very likely, given this Jewish background, that is a model by which some Jews, and I'm going to argue particularly Jews in Jerusalem, by which they would have processed the death of Christ. Let me also mention that there is no New Testament book, no other place in the New Testament other than Hebrews, that argues for the universal, absolute atonement for all time of Christ's death. Now, I realize that we might debate that, especially when it comes to Paul's writings. I think Paul's writings fit very well with Hebrews on this topic. My point is merely that Paul never draws that conclusion. Some of you may want to debate me on that. We'll have to do it another time. I think you're not reading Paul carefully. Again, you're making assumptions if you assume that some of his rhetoric implies all people are atoned for by Christ's death. I'm not saying that Christ didn't. I'm not saying that Paul didn't agree with that. I'm just saying that he does not explicitly say that, as far as I can tell, anywhere in his writings. And of course, Mark 10:25, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Not any proof, but again, for many. Notice that. Here's the real linchpin to me in this argument. I think the most convincing thing to you all is if you look at Acts 21. This is where James sits Paul down, and James says, hey, look at how many believers there are here in Jerusalem, and they're all zealous for the law. They've heard bad things about you, Paul. They hear that you're telling Jews out there in the diaspora not to observe the law of Moses. You need to show them that this isn't true. You need to show them that you're a law-observant Jew. Here's an idea. There's some guys who've taken a vow, and they're going to go do their purification rites. Why don't you pay for their sacrifices and purification to show that you're a law-observant Jew? Notice the significance of this. Acts implies that Jerusalem Christians still participated in the sacrificial system of the temple, and that Paul was okay with offering sacrifices there as well. Now, Paul was a very pragmatic guy, and of course, this is Acts presenting us Paul. But my basic point is that we have good evidence that the Jerusalem church still participated in the temple. And remember from my last vodcast that I suggested that Roman Christianity probably had greater affinities with Jerusalem Christianity than it did with Paul's Christianity. And I'm drawing on Ambrosiaster and so forth in that claim. So I think I've made a pretty good argument that there would have been some Jerusalem Christians who were troubled by the temple's destruction in relation to atonement, and that there's a good possibility that the Roman Christians might have been as well. This is a can of worms here. I don't want to get into it, but I want to notice that there are a number of prophetic texts in the New Testament that look to the temple's desecration rather than destruction. Thessalonians, a man of lawlessness sets himself up in the temple as God. Mark 13:14, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it shouldn't be. Now, Jesus did predict the destruction of the temple, but I'm not 100% sure that the earliest Christians fully understood that he was literally there. I won't get into that can of worms. I want to just say that hindsight is 2020. I personally date all of the Gospels to after AD 70, all the Gospels to after the destruction of the temple. And so in that sense, it's pretty clear what Jesus meant by that time. I won't get into that. I don't need to prove any of that to make the case. I only need to show that there might have been some Christians who were troubled by the loss of the place where daily atonement took place. I think it is a mistake to assume that Gentile converts to Christian Judaism would not have had just as much a potential investment in the atonement of the temple as Christian Jews. Let me make this clear. I've argued thus far that there were probably some Christian Jews who still had an investment in the daily atonement provided by the Jerusalem temple. My argument here is that if that's the case, then it's virtually certain that there were Christian Gentiles who likewise had an investment in the atonement provided by the Jerusalem temple. In fact, any investment they had to Roman temples or Greek temples would have likely been transferred to the Jerusalem temple when they believed on Christ as Messiah, if they were in that kind of conservative wing of early Christianity. And the restoration of Israel, I would say, was a significant part of early Christian belief. What does Paul say in Romans 11, is it 26? That eventually all Israel will be saved and the Lord will appear from Zion. I don't see any way, given the immediate context of that we can say that that is a reference to anything other than the idea that ethnic Israel that was currently unbelieving at the time of Paul would eventually come to faith. And so I believe Paul expected eventually Israel to come to faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And of course, the book of Acts, I think, Luke Acts talks about Jerusalem will be trampled on until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So this idea that Israel as a political entity has a part in the future is part of the New Testament. And so the idea that God would let Jerusalem be destroyed, again, you can accommodate that idea easily enough, especially since she said this. But for it to stay destroyed, for the Messiah not to appear, okay, Israel's been punished now, let's get everything set to right. That's a bit troubling. Would have been troubling, I think, to many early Christians. Argument number 4. We should also not underestimate the humiliation and shame Roman believers would have experienced in the wake of Jerusalem's destruction. I mean, the Romans gloated in their victory. I mean, they really gloated. I mean, they didn't go shake hands with the Jews after they destroyed the city. They took people, Jewish prisoners, important people, back to Rome. They paraded them through the streets and then killed them. There was celebration. There were arches that were erected to the victory that you can still see today. So this was a big deal. We beat the Jews, yada yada. I mean, this was paraded throughout Jerusalem, throughout Rome, and we beat you. I mean, this would have been absolutely humiliating, I believe, for not only Jews in Rome, but Christian Jews in Rome and Christian Gentiles in Rome who associated with Judaism. And no doubt they would have felt very insecure in that kind of environment, very vulnerable, which I think explains some of the rhetoric of Hebrews 11. So, my summary of my proposal for the situation of Hebrews. A group of Gentile converts to Christian Judaism find their faith shaken when the Jewish God lets his temple be destroyed by the Romans and Christ does not return. The author tells them to buck up, little camper. Keep going. You've only got a couple more laps. In just a little while, the Lord will return. Christ is the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. You worried about the temple not being here? The temple was never meant to take away sins. It was just a shadowy example of that which Christ himself would fulfill. And Christ didn't enter into some earthly temple, to offer, daily or yearly, but Christ entered into heaven itself to offer a sacrifice that would be good. With one sacrifice, he has forever ended and sanctified those who are being perfected. That is my suggestion, my proposal for the situation of Hebrews. Thank you for joining me in this third podcast.